All this week on The Perspective, a therapeutic distraction from the woes of this world, as we talk with artists, pastors, and worship leaders about the important question, what exactly is worship in the changing church today? Plus, is church growing or shrinking? There are copious amounts of information on both. Ron McCoy of the Rogo Foundation is here to tell us about the ingenious ways people and churches are merging together after COVID gave us quite a good punch. Whether your worship is in private or in a congregation, one thing is for certain: God speaks to us through art and music that has the power to heal and soothe us. Imago's John Franklin is here with artist Ruthia Pak Regis. Perspective regular Nolan Benny talks worship and music. Plus, Chichi O shares his giftings and humor. A talented artist and gifted speaker, he admits to being a true Golden Girls fan. And Derek Tam of the Worship Project invites us into his incredible world of music and connection as we continue to pray for the people of Ukraine and Russia.
Hey, I'm glad you're with us today on The Perspective as we delve into a subject that maybe you haven't been thinking a lot about. But before we get there, I want to pick on my amazing co-host, Julie Stautland. You know, the news out today is that the masks are going to be lifted here in Ontario in about another week. And I know you're traveling back to Ontario. You've been suffering a little bit in Florida. Where are you today? Tell us.
I'm in Nashville. Yes.
In Nashville. So will we hear country and Western music pretty soon, or what's the deal with that?
You never know in Nashville.
Okay, so the masking thing, Julie, is that going to really bother you to take the mask off, or are you one of these fashion women that have the amazing mask? Come on, fess up.
Well, you know, I absolutely detest them. I wore them because I had to, but you know, a little bling if I have to. What about you? Did you have a superhero mask or something?
No, I don't need a superhero mask. Not when you are a superhero. That was terrible. No, I'm just basic black. That's it. Nothing else, whatever. But hey, you know, as we talk about masks, in all seriousness, sometimes when we take off the mask, I've been joking, saying no one's going to recognize us for a little while because we're used to the mask, looking at people's eyes. But I want us today to unmask the whole subject of worship. What does it really mean to worship God, to know Him? And we got two amazing guests that are going to be helping us with that. John Franklin and Ruthia Pak Regis is going to be with us as we unpack the whole subject of worship. Well, as we're dealing with the whole subject of worship this week, I am delighted to have John Franklin with us today on the program. John, I want to welcome you today. It's a flashback for me. Thanks for coming on.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Michael.
Well, you know, John, when I saw the name and the picture, I had to go back. I hate to admit it, but it was 1980 when I first met you, and you were my prof in college.
True enough. I remember.
You remember? I don't know
I
if
do.
that's... I just want to know, how come you didn't give me a better mark? I thought I slipped you $100 and that would have helped.
Yeah, no, you got what you merited, I'm afraid. You got what you merited.
Okay, John, you've been leading a wonderful work called Imago, and it's an organization you've been running and leading for some time now. Tell us about this wonderful work that you're doing.
Well, I've been in the leadership of Imago for 22, 23 years now. It's actually in its 50th year. And Imago is an organization that advocates for Christians in the arts. So whether you're a poet, a dancer, a filmmaker, a musician, a visual artist, whatever you may be, that we want to advocate for you. Very often, people have found that in the church, they tend to be marginalized, that is artists, because of their art. And in the culture, the arts culture, they're marginalized because of their faith. And so what Imago is a place to affirm the artist in both in terms of their art and their faith.
You know, as you talk about that, I have a flashback. I was thinking about when a fire broke out in Buckingham Palace years ago, the Queen was grabbing some art, and it just seemed so out of place for her to to be doing that, but that's what she was doing. As we watching the bombings in Ukraine and seeing the beautiful architecture, there was a part of me actually that was saying, oh my goodness, they're destroying all this beautiful stuff that's been created. How does art impact us in the way that it does? Because a lot of times we almost seem we're immune to it, but it really is a way that God uses to connect with our soul. Talk to me about that.
It's part of our cultural identity. I mean, identity is very important for us, both individual identity, but also cultural identity. And art reminds us of our history. It's one of the ways we see ourselves in terms of memory in the past. And art, another thing that art is able to do is to open us up to fresh possibilities as to how we see things. Not only does it touch our memories, but it also helps us to see ahead and what we might be able to do through the arts in a creative and imaginative way.
Well, unpack that a little bit for me, John, because if I do confess something, you did open my eyes to appreciating art when I had you as a prof years ago, and I want to thank you for that. You awoke something in me that I didn't, it was like a sleeping giant. But how does art help us to see into the future?
Well, what it does, not necessarily that, but I think, well, let me see if I can answer this more clearly. I think that the arts are inherently hopeful. The very fact that we can create says there's more than meets the eye. When you look at a work of art, it helps you to see something in a way you didn't see it before. And in that sense, I think art is hopeful. And I also think that the arts have a lot to do with the work of the Spirit in the world. So imagination is open to possibilities. And the artist, the creative, is a person who engages imagination. And that's why we see ever new things coming out of the arts world. And when you think of newness, one has to also think of resurrection and the promise in Scripture that all things will be made new.
I love that analogy. I'm already jumping ahead to Easter, but let me just backtrack for a bit. As you think about art and the way you've described it, how do you see that it could or should intersect with the whole concept of worship? Because that's really what we're talking about this whole week on the program. How do they intersect?
Well, I think they're essential. And the reason I say that, Mike, is because there's been a tendency within our faith communities to intellectualize the faith, and frankly, also to disembody it. So what art is able to do is to bring us back to a sense of embodiment, whether it's dance or drama or whatever it may be. And also, it's able to touch our affections. We need to be moved. And art has this capacity to move us. If you hear a beautiful piece of music or watch a dance or go to a film, you can be deeply moved and it can actually be transforming for you. So I think that worship requires the aesthetic, if I may put it that way, the arts in order to be effective.
You know, John, later on in the program, someone that you're working with, Ruthia Pak Regis, is going to be with us, and she's going to be talking in detail about the crossings. But this is an interesting project that you've been working on as well. What can you tell us about it?
Well, Crossings is part of an international series of exhibitions, began in London in 2016, and there's been one in Amsterdam and Washington and New York. The Canadian one is the Toronto one is entirely Canadian artists. And in addition to the visual arts artists, we also have poets. And this is an opportunity to take the Jesus narrative, the passion narrative, which has had a profound influence in Western culture, profound influence, and to bring it into the public square. That's really what this artwork is doing. And this is a deeply human story, Michael. It's a religious story. It's a story of redemption, but it's deeply human because it deals with betrayal and vulnerability and suffering, but also hope and love.
Well, just even as you described that, has created a huge interest within me to go and see these things. Where do we find them in Toronto?
Well, you can go to Crossings Toronto, and there's a map there. There's a number of ways you can find it, but it's down on the university campus, and then at some places up in the north of the city, north, St. Clair Yonge area.
We'll be looking to hear more of that as Julie is talking to Ruthia Pak Regis in just a moment. John Franklin, thank you for being with us today. I appreciate you speaking into our hearts on the whole subject of worship and art.
Thank you, Michael.
As we weave in and out of pandemic restrictions, Canadians are weary of intensified anxiety, fear, and isolation across our communities. There is heightened social and economic uncertainty. Our society is struggling with issues of systemic racism and the shame of the residential school tragedies. Our hearts long for normalcy, for hope, and for renewal. How can we reconcile with one another in the face of uncertainty and pain? This spring, enjoy the reflection and renewal that art offers. Crossings Toronto is an outdoor art exhibition across 16 sites, each with an artwork conveying a piece of the Easter story.
Ruthia, thank you for joining us today. I can't tell you how excited I am about this because I am a person that enjoys the arts and I come from an artsy background, and I have a daughter in Sweden who's at the Florence Academy of Art, singer-songwriter and fine artist. So art. I just love how that is used. And I know that you have been involved in the crossings and you have created a piece of art. I would love to hear what you chose to do.
Okay, thank you, Julie. I was assigned Station 9, where Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. And so I meditated on the passage, and I'm a painter. So it's a painting on canvas, 5 feet by 4 feet. And it was just a process of really thinking about what that story means to me, because I had always just thought of it as a historical happening, something that happened to some people a long time ago, something that Jesus said a long time ago. But having to put it through myself and then out onto canvas really meant that I had to try and really connect with it, the story. And what does it mean even to be a woman or a woman of Jerusalem? And then suddenly that idea expanded to include me. And the figures in my painting are of my mom, myself, and my 2 daughters at different points in time. And so I've been telling people how when I started painting my daughters into the painting, they would ask, why am I in the painting? And I would say, because you're a woman of Jerusalem. And so taking on that identity, what does it mean? And that Jesus would point us, our grief and wailing, away from him and to us. I mean, this is something that opens up how we can maybe grapple with our own grief and know that we have the space to do that, actually. And what that means in the story of Jesus, actually, the overarching story of Jesus. What does that mean for our own personal experiences? Yeah.
That's very powerful, to that image, just as you're describing it to me. When you do this, I know for myself, because worship just so affects me. Do you find that this process of trying to figure out what you're going to paint and how you're going to paint it, is that like a type of worship for you when you're doing it?
I would say yes, because if worship is my response to God and to hold him high and honor him, I really hope that's what I'm doing with my practice. Just the internal process that goes on before, during, and even after the painting is made. Even though it may not explicitly be, oh, God, Jesus, worship in my mind, it all still has an impact on each other. And I know that it's taken me many years to accept the fact that even if it's not theological in nature sometimes, it is still a part of who I am and how I can respond to this life that God has given us and to the salvation story that we are offered. Salvation, actually, that we are offered. Yes. So this response, whether it's in the painting or even cleaning the house, I would hope that all of that kind of ties in together as an overall gift that I might bring to God.
So as an artist, do you also find, I know for myself that just being out going for a walk sometimes or just admiring, do you find that nature and the community, in your art, do you find that inspires you as well?
Yeah. Anything. It could be anything, actually, even some dots on a wall somewhere. Maybe the dots are just splattered about just so, and it might not even be intentional, but yet there's some kind of beauty. And I think we find a beauty in different places. We're all very different people. And so wherever we find ourselves, I do believe that God offers beauty to us wherever we are, even during hard times, struggling times.
Yeah. For the crossings, was there a criteria for style, or what was the process for involving artists? Can you tell me a little bit more about the details of that?
Well, I know John was the major force behind finding artists and inviting artists and bringing us all together. And I know the process has been a little different for the various artists, because some people knew about this project 2 years ago. I myself found out about it in late fall, I think it was. But I was given the station, the scriptural reference for it, and also complete creative freedom.
Wow.
Which is the best way to work, really. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
So each artist was able then to really, truly focus and hone in and see where they felt led and inspired. That's really great. I want to bring Mike back to the conversation as well.
Hey, Ruthia, I'm intrigued as I'm listening to you unpack the story. And as a communicator, I know that I try to get at least one clear thought across. And if I do that, I feel somewhat successful. If you could think about your painting as communicating one specific thought, would you be able to narrow it down what you were hoping to accomplish?
I'm sorry, that's a really hard ask. Okay, I just hope that for my painting, that people will take a moment to stop and to be receptive and to wonder. And I hope that will be where God's Spirit can move in anyone.
I think that's a great purpose. I mean, that is so important, just to stop, to take it in, and to think differently, to look differently. And hopefully, as a result of this, that we all will live differently. Ruthia, I want to thank you for just pouring your heart into this project. We look forward to sharing it on TV. I want to be able to share the project once it's out in public. I want to encourage people to go to the crossings and take the moment, take the time with your family to visit these artistic impressions, so that the whole journey of the cross, the stations of the cross, come alive in your life and in mine as well.
Colleen McLaughlin Barlow, who is covering Jesus carrying his cross through the streets, says,
We don't talk about hope an awful lot. The act that the Christ is doing in that moment is so awesomely beautiful.
Whether you are deeply faithful, spiritually aware, or just love art, visit Crossings Toronto between March 2nd and April 14th. Hashtag Crossings Toronto, or go to crossingstoronto.com to learn more.
Hey, have you ever done something and just felt really embarrassed because it just was a bomb or exposed you in a way that you didn't want to see? I had that happen to me on more than one occasion, but on one occasion in particular, what it showed to me about what was inside bothered me even more. Let me take you back. I'm going to test your Canadian geography. There's a place called Boundary Bay. It's a beautiful spot in Tsawwassen. Tsawwassen is where the ferries sail out of Vancouver over to Vancouver Island. And when we had first moved there, I used to hang out at the beach. And I got to meet a lady. Her name was Esther. Esther ran a little kiosk. And over time, my wife and I would buy food from her, would sit on the beach, watch the sunsets, and that was all great. Esther shared with us one day how that she was serving at an upscale function, and she didn't have anyone to serve. And so I kindly volunteered my wife and myself. I said, oh, we'll come and do it for you. And what I didn't realize, what it was going to show me about who I really was. And so suddenly we get into this event, and we're her servants. We're doing it for free. And you know what? This is the servant guard. So I'm feeling pretty good about myself, kind of looking like this. But you know what? You put on the apron, and you know what that's like. And suddenly you put the apron on, and people see you in a different way. And if I could ever tie this thing up, it'd be even better. You can do that. Maybe I should have lost some weight so I can get it around me. But anyways, we get it on, and oh yeah, we can get rid of this. Put this in, because a good waiter is always going to have a napkin ready for someone. I know you think I'm stupid, but that's all right. Just work with me, folks. And then we have this thing draped over our arm. And my job was to go around and serve the guests. Now, folks, I've been to school for 10 years now, postgraduate work. I've got a doctorate and stuff like this. I was really proud of myself. And I got serving coffee to the people. And I would chit-chat with them, because I really, down deep, wanted them to know that I was doing this for free, even though I didn't say it. And you know what? They just wanted to snap their fingers. Hey, you, can you bring me something? I'm thinking, whoa. And I'm so embarrassed to admit this. I said to one guy, you know, I've got a doctorate degree. And he kind of looked at me and said, yeah, I'm sure you're the Pope as well. And when the whole thing was over, we did have fun. We served the people. But I thought some of those people were really unappreciative. They were actually a bit of a pain. And the idea of being a servant, well, it just didn't sit that well with me. And you know what? Well, I don't want to say where I wanted to put that little serviette with some of those people. But hey, maybe that helps us to understand the change that happened in a guy by the name of Paul. Started off, his name was Saul. He had an encounter with Jesus, and it changed him from the inside out. He actually was given a new name, the name of Paul. When he was Saul, he was known as the one who was persecuting the church. And he's the one we've been talking about over the last week and a half out of the book of Colossians. He wrote it when he was sitting in prison. And I've discovered that one of the things about worship is that when I truly worship God, when I'm caught up with him, I suddenly realize that he doesn't care whether I have a nice suit jacket on. He doesn't care whether I have the garb of a servant on. But he is more concerned about where my heart is at. And Paul wrote these words to the church in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 24 and 25. He talked about identifying with Christ's afflictions for the sake of the body that is the church. He said, of which I became a minister according to the stewardship or the gift of God that was given to me for you. So he recognizes that God called him into his family. He said, God did a work in my life so that I could be a gift to the church. What an interesting way of looking at the purpose of our lives. Have you ever thought about the purpose for which God created you? Well, I want you to know something, that God created us to serve people. Because as we serve, we're actually doing it as unto the Lord. That really becomes an expression of our worship. Why do I care for my wife? Why do I care for my children? Is it only to get something in return? Or why should I care for my neighbor? Or why should I care for you? Or why should we collect funds for the Ukraine? It's because God calls us to serve not just the church, but to serve people in general. Because it says the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus came to be a servant to us, to show us what the greatness of God's love is all about. See, the idea of a servant that Paul used here, it carries three words. It means three things. One, it's kind of like the busboy, the servant, the one who pours the coffee. And the Greeks had a word for it. It was called diakonai. But then there was also another word for servant. When Paul talks here, it means someone who is totally submissive to an under. That's the picture of slavery that we often hear about. And Paul says, I'm a servant of Jesus Christ. I choose to be his slave. We have a choice to accept his love or not, to reject it. But he said, I choose to accept the fact that Jesus is my master. And then there was another word. I could tell you the Greek word, but it doesn't really matter. It means to be an under rower. It was the picture of the people that were rowing in the galleons, in the slave ships. It was the one who was 3 rows down. It meant that they were the most likely to die. And it speaks of someone who has given up their rights, saying, I am willing even to die for you. Well, That's the picture of a servant. It's the picture of what God does in our life when we become yielded to him. And I believe it becomes an expression of incredible worship when we understand that and say, God, live through me, love through me, just as we have seen it modeled in your Son, the Lord Jesus.
So, Mike, if I hear you right, it's not all about me?
It's all about you, Julie. It's all about you. It's not about me.
I have to be a servant?
You've got to be a servant. You got to be a servant. You should be pouring the coffee today, not me, but okay, I'll pour. I have a cup here for you as well as soon as you get back on the set.
All right.
And you know, as we have a little bit of fun with that, folks, as we're poking it back and forth, one of the things that we need to remember is that it's Christ who can change us from the inside out. And when we get caught up with worshiping him and seeing him for all his glory, that can change our lives and we become the people that God created us to be.
As we weave in and out of pandemic restrictions, Canadians are weary of intensified anxiety, fear, and isolation across our communities. There is heightened social and economic uncertainty. Our society is struggling with issues of systemic racism and the shame of the residential school tragedies. Our hearts long for normalcy, for hope, and for renewal. How can we reconcile with one another in the face of uncertainty and pain? This spring, enjoy the reflection and renewal that art offers. Crossings Toronto is an outdoor art exhibition across 16 sites, each with an artwork conveying a piece of the Easter story.
Crossings Toronto draws upon the centuries-old Christian spiritual practice of walking and praying the Stations of the Cross. The stations are captured through sacred art, expressing the dramatic moments of Jesus' final hours.
Walk figuratively along the path that Jesus took through the intense journey of unjust suffering. See the artistic interpretations offered by leading diverse Canadian artists on their piece of the story. Reflect on how the story relates to today's issues of social justice and equity. Visit Crossings Toronto between March 2nd and April 14th. Hashtag Crossings Toronto or go to crossingstoronto.com to learn more.